Hi, I want to introduce you to the concept of Access macros. In this video, I want to discuss about macros being the beginnings of programming. I want to then discuss some types of macros, including event-driven macros, then standalone macros, and then finally data macros. So to begin, I want to compare access macros to some other kinds of macros that you may have been introduced to and used in the past. And those would be the ones that are in Word and Excel. And for those who haven't ever used the macros in Word or Excel, what happens is you click on a record button and then you do the actions that you want to record, and then you stop the recorder. And this is true in both Word and Excel. And once the recorder is done, then the underlying workings of Word and Excel switch those actions into Visual Basic Code. And so then when you run those macros in either Word or Excel, what you're really doing is you're running Visual Basic Code. But that is underlying and you do not see that. In Access, you are actually giving commands inside of an editor that you as the user set up, and then you put those commands in a logical order to achieve a certain goal that you have for that particular macro. And really, this is the beginnings of programming, because that's a lot of what programming is, giving commands to the computer in a logical order to achieve a certain outcome. To begin, I want to talk about standalone macros. And now you can see that I've switched over to this particular database. A standalone macro is something that you create by coming up here to create and then clicking on macro. And you give it certain commands, whatever the commands are that you want to have in the macro, and then you save it. And after you've saved it, it will show up down in the list of macros in the navigation pane. So just to show you an example of a command in a macro, I'll say open form, and then I will type in a name of a form, main menu, okay? And so this particular command will make the form main menu open, and so that you can use it. And then I'll go ahead and give it one more command, and I'll just say beep. And so then the form will open, and then it will beep. And so to save it, I'll click here, and then I will say open main menu as the name of the macro. And I'll say OK. Now with a standalone macro, I can run it from here by double clicking. And I can also come over here to design and click on run. And in fact, I just did that, and it opened the form main menu, and you heard the beep. So it did both commands that I made it do. So that's a basic introduction to standalone macros. So now I'd like to move on to event-driven macros. And in order to do that, I want to come here to this report, and I'm just going to go ahead and go into design view. So here's the design view of this particular report. And you'll notice that this button here is pushed. It's got a black mark on it so that when you click on it, you can come over here to the property sheet and look and see that the properties that are being listed here are for this report. Okay? And there are lots of different properties for this particular report. But I want to hone in on the Event tab. This right here is a list of all the properties for this particular tab. And it is in fact called Event, which relates to the event-driven macros. You'll notice that there are lots of different properties here, or another way to put it is events. So with event-driven macros, what happens is that a macro will run when a specific event occurs, but you have to associate a macro with that event in order for something to happen. So for example, here for the onClose event, meaning when I close the report, this particular embedded macro will run. Now, other places, other events here have no macro associated with them. So nothing will happen when those events occur. But in the case here, an embedded macro will run. So let me explain about embedded macros versus standalone macros for event-driven macros. It's like, that's a little confusing. What? What I'm talking about is that you can place a macro in here that's a standalone macro. Let me show you what I mean. I can click here and click down, and there is a macro that we've already built that's a standalone macro, and I could in fact click on that, and then when the report would open, it would open also the main menu because this particular macro, that's what it does. Now I don't really want that, so I'm going to remove that. But you can also have an embedded macro. And to show you the embedded macro, I'm going to click here. And so what an embedded macro is a macro that you make within the report itself. It doesn't get run anywhere else. It's just here for this specific purpose only. And in this particular embedded macro, all I have is a command open form main menu. So what is going to happen is when the event of closing, and you can see on close that it says there, when the event of closing the report happens, then it's going to go and open the form main menu. So just to recap, you can have here on any particular event an indication of running a standalone macro, or you can click on the build button here and create your own macro by typing in commands in a logical order based on how you want them to occur. So now I want to move on to data macros. In order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and close this report, And I'm going to come over here and switch to a different database. Now, data macros are different than event-driven macros because they act upon tables, actually records inside of tables, or when certain events happen inside of a table on particular records, then it will execute the commands in a macro. But the difference between data macros and, say, event-driven macros are that event-driven macros execute on forms or reports. Data macros, again, are only run on tables and have to do with tables. So I want to show you an example of a data-driven macro. So I'm going to go into design view of this particular table. And as you know, as you've seen, I'm sure before, this is the design of a table. If I come up here to design and then I come to this particular icon, you'll see it says create data macros. And if I click down, there are a list of events that you can associate with a macro. For example, here is the before change event. You can click on it and see that I have created a macro based on the before change event. What that means is before a record is changed and recorded, run these two commands. The first one takes and looks at the field auto event or EV event plan ID and then changes it into a string data type and then places that value into EV events str EV event plan ID. And the other command just takes the date and time and places it into this particular field, DTE EV last updated. And that's basically all this macro does. So that's just one example of many different kinds of macros that you can create to associate with various events that may happen to a record in a table. So now I just want to recap what I've gone over in this video. I've talked about macros in Access being different from Word or Excel or maybe other programs that you've used, and how they are the beginnings of programming. I've talked about different kinds of macros. I've talked about event-driven macros. I've talked about standalone macros and data macros. And so hopefully that gives you just an introduction into the concept of macros in Access. And I will go into more detail in other videos. Thanks.